Think your morning routine is rough? Imagine waking up at 2 a.m. to the sound of a bell, stumbling through pitch-black stone corridors in bare feet, and standing for hours of prayer in a freezing church. All before breakfast. And by breakfast, I mean a chunk of bread and maybe some watery porridge if you're lucky. Welcome to the daily life of a medieval monk, where comfort was considered a sin and your entire existence was regulated down to when you could speak, scratch an itch, or relieve yourself. When we picture medieval monks today, we often conjure images of peaceful men in brown robes, contentedly copying manuscripts in sun-dappled rooms or tending herb gardens, while birds chirp overhead. Maybe you imagine them brewing beer and making cheese in idyllic countryside monasteries. But the reality? It was a life of brutal discipline, mind-numbing repetition, physical hardship, and psychological torment that would break most of us within days. Medieval monasticism wasn't a career choice for the faint-hearted. It was a lifelong commitment to what was essentially a spiritual prison, one where you voluntarily surrendered your identity, your autonomy, your possessions, your family connections, and often your sanity in pursuit of salvation. The monastery gates might not have been locked, but once you took your vows, the invisible chains of obligation, community pressure, and religious fear bound you more effectively than any physical restraint. So let's strip away the romantic notions and dive into the harsh reality of what it actually meant to be a medieval monk. Could you handle a life where speaking out of turn could earn you a public flogging? Where questioning authority might land you in solitary confinement? Where your every waking moment was scheduled, supervised, and scrutinized for signs of sin or disobedience? Let's find out. Imagine being as young as 7 years old when your parents decide your fate. That's right. Medieval monasteries regularly accepted child oblates, boys offered by their families as living sacrifices to God. Maybe you were a spare son in a noble family that couldn't afford multiple inheritances. Perhaps your parents were seeking spiritual merit by giving their child to the church. Or maybe you had a physical deformity that made you unmarriageable. Whatever the reason, you had no say in the matter. But wait, you might be thinking, couldn't adults choose this life freely? Sure, some did. Merchants seeking atonement for their sins, widowers with nowhere else to go, younger sons of nobility looking for education and status. But free choice in medieval times was a relative concept, heavily influenced by limited options, family pressure, and the terrifying spectre of eternal damnation that the church dangled over everyone's heads. The initiation process was designed to break you down completely before rebuilding you as a monk. First came the novitiate, a probationary period lasting at least a year, during which you'd get your first taste of the crushing routine that would become your life. You'd surrender your clothes, literally stripping away your former identity, and don the simple habit that would become your uniform until death. Your head would be shaved in the distinctive tonsure, physically marking you as church property. Remember all those personal possessions you cherished? Gone. That comfortable bed you used to sleep in? Replaced with a thin straw mattress on a hard wooden platform. Privacy? Forget it. You'd sleep in a dormitory with dozens of other monks, often without even a curtain between beds. Personal space was considered an indulgence, and indulgence was the enemy of spiritual purity. The ceremony of profession, when you officially became a monk, was essentially a funeral for your former self. You'd prostrate yourself on the cold stone floor of the church, covered with a funeral pall, while death prayers were chanted over you. The message was unmistakable. The person you were had died, and a new communal identity was taking its place. You'd even take a new name, severing one of the last connections to your previous life. Think that sounds dramatic? It was meant to be. The Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational document for Western monasticism, didn't mince words about what you were signing up for. From this day, you're no longer free to leave the cloister, nor can you shake from your neck the yoke of the rule. And that yoke was about to become painfully apparent as you learned the crushing daily schedule that would structure every remaining day of your life. Forget sleeping in. Forget choosing what to do with your day. From the moment you took your vows, your life was no longer your own. It belonged to God, as interpreted by your abbot and enforced by a rigid schedule that would make modern military boot camp look relaxed by comparison. The monastic day revolved around the divine office, 8 prayer services spread throughout every 24 hours. The first, Matins, typically began around 2 a.m. That's right, you'd be jolted awake in the middle of the night by the monastery bell, expected to shake off sleep immediately and make your way to the church. And you'd better not be late, because tardiness was a punishable offence. Let's walk through a typical day in a Benedictine monastery in, say, 12th century England. 2 a.m, the night bell rings. You drag yourself from your hard bed in the unheated dormitory, fumble for your robe in the dark, no individual candles allowed, fire hazard and unnecessary luxury, and shuffle with your brothers down to the church for Matins, the longest service of the day. For the next 2 hours, you'll stand or kneel on the cold stone floor, chanting psalms and prayers in Latin. 4 a.m, Matins ends, but you don't get to go back to bed. Instead, it's time for Lauds, another service lasting about 30 to 45 minutes. 4:45 a.m. If you're lucky, you might get a brief period of rest now, not in bed, but sitting fully clothed in the cloister or chapter house, perhaps studying religious texts by the dim light of dawn. 6 a.m. prime, the first daylight service. Afterward, there's a chapter meeting where the day's work assignments are distributed and public confessions and punishments take place. Did you whisper during last night's great silence? Expect to be called out and possibly flogged in front of everyone. 7 a.m. Time for the first meal of the day, often just bread and ale, eaten in complete silence while someone reads scripture aloud. Using the wrong hand to pick up your bread, that's a punishment. Making eye contact with another monk during the meal, punishment. Spilling your drink, you guessed it, punishment. 7:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Work period. Depending on your assigned role, you might be copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, hunched over a desk for hours, fingers cramping from holding a quill, eyes straining in poor light. Working in the fields, manual labour regardless of weather, tending to monastery animals, or performing administrative duties if you're among the few educated enough for such tasks. 11:30. Terce, another prayer service. 12 p.m. The main meal of the day, still eaten in silence, still accompanied by scripture readings. The diet, predominantly vegetarian for most of the year. Beans, peas, eggs, fish on certain days, bread, cheese, seasonal vegetables. Meat was generally reserved for feast days or for monks in the infirmary. And portion control was strict. Gluttony was a deadly sin after all. 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. More work or study time. 2:30 p.m. Another prayer service. 3 p.m. none, yet another prayer service. 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. More work, study, or perhaps a period of authorised conversation in the cloister. One of the few times talking was permitted. 5 p.m. Vespers, an evening prayer service. 6 p.m. A light supper, if allowed at all, during many parts of the year, particularly Lent and Advent, which together covered nearly half the calendar. This second meal was prohibited. 7 p.m. Compline, the final prayer service of the day, followed immediately by the Great Silence, a period when absolutely no talking was permitted under any circumstances until after prime the next morning. 7:30 p.m. Bed. But don't get too comfortable. You'll be up again at 2 a.m. to start the whole cycle over. And remember, you sleep in your habit, on a hard mattress, in a communal dormitory, where someone might be snoring, coughing, or suffering night terrors next to you. This wasn't just for a day, a week, or even a year. This was your life every day, with minimal variation, for decades, until you died. The only breaks from routine came with religious feast days, which still involved extensive prayer but might include better food or a reprieve from work. Think you could handle that level of regimentation? Most modern people would crack within days. The complete lack of personal autonomy, the endless repetition, the sleep deprivation, and the constant surveillance created a psychological pressure cooker that was specifically designed to crush individuality and foster absolute obedience. The monastic life wasn't just mentally taxing, it was physically brutal in ways that accumulated over time, wearing down even the strongest bodies. Let's start with sleep deprivation. The interrupted sleep pattern of the monastic schedule, bed at 7:30 p.m, up at 2 a.m. for several hours, then perhaps a brief rest before fully starting the day, created a chronic state of exhaustion. Modern sleep science has shown that interrupted sleep is nearly as harmful as no sleep at all. Medieval monks essentially lived in a perpetual state of sleep deficit, which we now know impairs cognitive function, weakens the immune system, and can lead to hallucinations, which might explain some of those religious visions monks frequently reported. Then there's the diet. While monastic fare wasn't necessarily starvation level, it was restrictive, monotonous, and nutritionally imbalanced by modern standards. The emphasis on bread, beans, and porridge, with limited protein and fresh produce, especially in winter, led to various deficiency diseases. Scurvy, rickets, and pellagra were common in monasteries, particularly during Lent when the already sparse diet became even more restricted. The physical environment itself was another source of suffering. Stone monasteries were freezing in winter and stifling in summer. Heating was minimal, usually limited to the infirmary and maybe the chapter house where elderly monks gathered. The church, where monks spent many hours each day, was typically the coldest building of all, with its high ceilings and stone floors. Monks would develop chilblains on their feet and hands from the constant cold, and respiratory infections spread rapidly in these conditions. Hygiene was basic at best. While monasteries were more advanced than the average medieval home in terms of sanitation, many had sophisticated latrine systems with running water. Personal hygiene was another matter. The rule of St. Benedict prescribed bathing only when necessary, which typically meant a few times a year. Daily washing was limited to hands, face, and sometimes feet. Monks wore the same wool habit, day and night, only changing clothes occasionally. This combination of poor hygiene, communal living, and weakened immune systems from poor nutrition and sleep deprivation made monasteries breeding grounds for disease. When illnesses struck, they spread rapidly through the community. During the Black Death of the 14th century, some monasteries lost up to 60% of their populations. The physical demands of labour added another layer of hardship. Not all monks were scribes. Many spent their days in heavy agricultural work, construction, or other manual tasks. Arthritis, hernias, and chronic back pain were occupational hazards. Even those working in the scriptorium suffered physically. The hunched posture required for manuscript copying led to spinal deformities, while the strain of detailed work by inadequate light caused vision problems. For those monks who did intellectual work, the physical toll came in different forms. Eye strain from reading poorly lit manuscripts was common, leading to declining vision with age. The cold, damp environment of libraries and scriptoria caused joint pain and rheumatism. The sedentary nature of scholarly work, combined with poor nutrition, led to digestive disorders that were exacerbated by the monastic diet. Self-mortification added yet another dimension of physical suffering for many monks. While the rule of St. Benedict was relatively moderate compared to some monastic traditions, many monks engaged in additional voluntary austerities. These might include wearing hair shirts, rough garments worn next to the skin to cause constant irritation, self-flagellation with whips or branches, extended fasting beyond what was required, or sleeping on the floor rather than on already uncomfortable beds. Consider Thomas Becket, the 12th century Archbishop of Canterbury, who was discovered after his death to have been wearing a hair shirt so infested with lice that his undergarments were boiling over with them like water in a simmering cauldron. This wasn't considered aberrant behaviour, it was admired as evidence of his piety. The cumulative effect of these physical hardships was premature ageing and early death for many monks. While some abbots and high-ranking religious officials lived to old age, benefiting from better food and living conditions, the average monk could expect a shorter lifespan than his lay counterparts of similar social standing. Archaeological excavations of monastic cemeteries have revealed skeletons showing signs of nutritional deficiencies, chronic infections, and degenerative joint diseases at rates higher than in comparable secular populations. Could your body withstand decades of this treatment? The constant cold, the sleep disruption, the nutritional deficiencies, the physical labour, all while being expected to maintain perfect attention during hours of daily prayer? For most of us accustomed to central heating, memory foam mattresses, and balanced diets, the physical reality of monastic life would be unbearable within weeks. If the physical hardships of monastic life were brutal, the psychological aspects were arguably even more crushing. The monastery was essentially a total institution, a closed environment where every aspect of life was controlled and monitored, where conformity was enforced through a complex system of rules, surveillance, and punishment. The cornerstone of monastic psychology was the concept of obedience, not just following orders, but completely surrendering your will to your superiors. The rule of Saint Benedict doesn't mince words. The first degree of humility is obedience without delay, as if the command came from God himself. This wasn't just about external compliance. You were expected to internalize this obedience so completely that you no longer even experienced contrary desires. Imagine living in a state of constant self-surveillance, where you're not only watched by others, but trained to ruthlessly monitor your own thoughts for signs of pride, doubt, or independent thinking. Medieval monasticism invented what we might now call thought crime, the idea that even unexpressed thoughts could be sinful and damnable. The psychological technique of custody of the eyes exemplifies this mental control. Monks were taught to keep their eyes downcast, never looking directly at others, or showing curiosity about their surroundings. This wasn't just about external modesty, it was a technique for controlling thought itself by limiting visual stimulation. By restricting what you could look at, the system restricted what you could think about. Then there was the silence. Modern people rarely experience true silence, but in a medieval monastery, the prohibition against speech was strictly enforced for much of the day. During the Great Silence from Compline until after prime the next morning, roughly 12 hours, absolutely no speaking was permitted except in dire emergencies. Even during work periods, conversation was limited and monitored. This enforced silence wasn't just about maintaining a quiet environment for prayer. It was a psychological tool for breaking down individual identity and reinforcing institutional control. Without the ability to freely express thoughts or form personal connections through conversation, monks became more isolated within themselves, even as they lived in close physical proximity to others. The confession system added another layer of psychological pressure. Monks were required to publicly confess even minor infractions of the rule during daily chapter meetings. Imagine standing before your entire community to admit that you dozed off during prayers or had a moment of irritation with another monk. This public humiliation served to enforce conformity and create a community where members policed each other. But it wasn't just about confessing actual rule violations. Monks were expected to constantly examine their consciousness for impure thoughts, inappropriate feelings, or moments of pride. The 12th century Cistercian abbot, Bernard of Clairvaux, advised monks to consider yourself as a kind of reservoir of guilt that can never run dry. This constant self-scrutiny created what psychologists today would recognize as a perfect environment for developing anxiety disorders, depression, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Medieval monastic texts are filled with accounts of monks tormented by scrupulosity, an obsessive concern with one's own sins and unworthiness that could drive individuals to despair. Consider the case of the 11th century monk Otlo of St. Emmeram, who described being so tormented by doubts and spiritual anxieties that he experienced what we would now recognize as panic attacks. My heart pounded, my mind was confused, and my whole body trembled. His contemporaries viewed this not as a mental health crisis, but as a spiritual trial to be endured. The monastery's physical layout reinforced this psychological control. The architectural design of most monasteries allowed for constant surveillance, open dormitories, chapter houses with clear sightlines, cloisters where monks could be observed as they moved between buildings. This created what modern sociologist Erving Goffman would call a panopticon effect, where individuals internalize the sense of being watched even when they aren't under direct observation. Social isolation from the outside world intensified these psychological pressures. Once you entered the monastery, contact with family and friends was severely restricted or eliminated entirely. Letters were censored, visitors were limited, and news from the outside world was carefully controlled. This severing of external social bonds made monks entirely dependent on the monastic community for human connection, reinforcing institutional control. For those who struggled with the psychological demands, the options were limited and grim. A monk experiencing what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety might be viewed as spiritually weak, slothful, or even possessed by demons. The prescribed remedies? More prayer, more fasting, more self-mortification, essentially intensifying the very conditions likely causing the psychological distress in the first place. In extreme cases, monks who repeatedly broke rules or questioned authority might face imprisonment in the monastery's prison cell. Yes, many monasteries had their own prisons. These weren't brief timeouts. Monastic incarceration could last months or years, often in conditions of sensory deprivation that would accelerate mental breakdown. Could your mind withstand this psychological pressure cooker? The constant self-monitoring, the public confession of minor infractions, the enforced silence, the complete surrender of autonomy, all while being isolated from outside support systems. For most modern individuals, raised with concepts of personal freedom and self-expression, the psychological regime of the medieval monastery would be more unbearable than its physical hardships. When we imagine medieval monks, we often picture scholarly figures hunched over illuminated manuscripts, preserving classical knowledge and creating beautiful books. While this image isn't entirely false, it dramatically misrepresents the intellectual reality for the vast majority of monks. First, let's burst the biggest bubble. Most monks weren't scholars or scribes. In a typical monastery, only a small percentage of monks worked in the scriptorium. The majority were engaged in agricultural labour, domestic tasks, administrative duties, or specialised crafts. Many monks, particularly those from peasant backgrounds, were functionally illiterate, or had only the most basic reading skills, enough to stumble through liturgical texts, but not to engage with complex theological or philosophical works. Even for those monks who did intellectual work, the nature of that work was far from the free inquiry or creative scholarship we might imagine. Medieval monastic intellectual life was rigidly controlled, with strict limitations on what could be read, studied, or discussed. The primary intellectual activity for most literate monks was not creating new knowledge, but memorizing and internalizing existing texts, primarily the Bible, patristic writings, works by early church fathers, and liturgical materials. A monk might spend years memorizing the entire Psalter, all 150 psalms, reciting them so often that they became ingrained in his memory. This memorization wasn't about intellectual engagement with the content, it was about perfect recall and recitation. Making a mistake in the liturgy, mispronouncing a Latin word, or missing a line in a psalm was a punishable offence. Imagine the stress of performing complex liturgical recitations from memory, in a language that wasn't your native tongue, knowing that errors would result in public humiliation or penance. For those few monks who did work as scribes, the reality was far from the romantic image of creative scholarship. Copying manuscripts was tedious, physically painful work that required hunching over a writing desk for hours in poor light. Scribes didn't choose what texts to copy. They were assigned works by their superiors, and their job was to reproduce them exactly, without error or personal interpretation. The famous illuminated manuscripts that we admire in museums today were luxury items produced by specialised monks in wealthy monasteries, often for external patrons. The average monastery produced utilitarian texts for internal use, plain, undecorated copies of religious works that emphasized function over beauty. Reading itself was tightly controlled. Monks didn't have personal libraries or free access to books. Monasteries typically kept their manuscript collections locked in a secure room, with books signed out under the supervision of the armarius, librarian. What you could read depended on your status within the community and your superior's assessment of what was appropriate for you. Independent study or intellectual curiosity was often viewed with suspicion rather than encouragement. The 12th century monastic writer Adam of Dryburgh warned, "Reading should be directed to a single end and should not be scattered. Those who want to read everything end by knowing nothing." The ideal was not broad learning, but deep, narrow focus on approved religious texts. Discussion and debate, the hallmarks of intellectual life in modern academia, were severely restricted in monasteries. Outside of formally structured educational settings, primarily in monasteries that trained novices, theological or philosophical discussions were discouraged as potentially leading to pride or heresy. The rule of St. Benedict explicitly warns against idle talk and frivolous conversation, categories that could easily include intellectual discussion, not directly related to spiritual edification. When monks did engage with classical or secular texts, it was always through the lens of Christian interpretation. Classical philosophy was studied not for its own sake, but to better defend Christian doctrine. Scientific texts were approached not as guides to understanding the natural world, but as allegories revealing God's design. This severely constrained the potential for genuine intellectual exploration. Innovation was explicitly discouraged. The ideal monk was one who faithfully transmitted tradition, not one who developed new ideas. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential monastic figures of the 12th century, declared, "I am not among those who are always learning and never arriving at knowledge of the truth. I prefer safe mediocrity to dangerous superiority." For monks with genuine intellectual gifts or curiosity, this environment could be stifling to the point of torment. Peter Abelard, the brilliant 12th century philosopher who briefly lived as a monk, described the monastic intellectual environment as one where questioning is seen as rebellion and inquiry as disobedience. His intellectual independence eventually led to his condemnation by church authorities. The psychological toll of this intellectual restriction was particularly heavy for those monks who entered the monastery with education or intellectual inclinations. Imagine having a curious, active mind and being told that your questions are sinful, that your intellectual interests are vanity, and that the highest form of knowledge is unquestioning acceptance of authority. For many, this intellectual suppression was as brutal as any physical hardship. Could you surrender your intellectual autonomy? Could you accept that questioning established interpretations might endanger your immortal soul? Could you spend decades copying texts without adding your own thoughts or interpretations? For most modern people raised in traditions that value critical thinking and intellectual exploration, the monastic approach to knowledge would be a form of mental imprisonment, more difficult to endure than cold stones or meagre food. The popular image of monasteries often portrays them as harmonious communities of like-minded brothers, united in purpose and living in serene cooperation. The reality was far more complex and often darker. Medieval monasteries were hierarchical, stratified societies where power was unevenly distributed and where social dynamics could be as brutal as any physical punishment. At the top of the monastic hierarchy stood the abbot, whose authority was nearly absolute. The rule of St. Benedict describes the abbot as believed to hold the place of Christ in the monastery, giving religious justification for unquestioning obedience. Abbots controlled every aspect of monastic life, from work assignments to punishments, from food distribution to who received medical care. Some abbots were wise and compassionate leaders. Others were tyrants who abused their power with impunity. Below the abbot was a complex hierarchy of officials: the prior, second in command, cellars, who managed provisions, infirmarers, who oversaw the sick, novice masters, and various other specialized roles. This administrative class often enjoyed better living conditions, exemptions from certain rules, and significant power over ordinary monks. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the ordinary monks, themselves divided by seniority. The rule specified that rank in the community shall be determined by the date of entry, the virtue of their lives, or the decision of the abbot. In practice, social background often trumped these official criteria. Monasteries were not egalitarian institutions. They reflected and reinforced the class divisions of medieval society. Monks from noble backgrounds typically received preferential treatment, better food, less manual labour, faster promotion to administrative positions. Those from peasant origins, regardless of their spiritual dedication or abilities, often remained in subordinate positions, assigned the hardest physical labour and the least desirable duties. This class division was institutionalised in many monasteries through the distinction between choir monks and lay brothers. Choir monks, typically from educated or noble backgrounds, focused on liturgical duties and intellectual work. Lay brothers, usually illiterate men from lower social classes, performed manual labour and were often treated as servants rather than full members of the community. The 13th century customary of the monastery of Cluny explicitly states that lay brothers should eat inferior food, wear coarser clothing, and sleep in separate quarters from choir monks. They were forbidden from learning to read, could not participate fully in liturgical services, and had no voice in community decisions. This was monastic apartheid, a rigid caste system dressed in religious language. Even among monks of similar rank, the social environment could be toxic. Monastic chronicles and disciplinary records reveal communities plagued by factions, favoritism, gossip, and bullying. The enforced proximity, living, working, eating and sleeping together in close quarters year after year, combined with the lack of privacy and outlets for frustration, created perfect conditions for interpersonal conflict. Consider the testimony from a 14th century monastic visitation, inspection, at the Abbey of St Albans, where investigators found that certain monks spread malicious gossip about their brothers and form cliques that exclude others. At the Monastery of Christ Church, Canterbury, records show complaints about monks who mock their brothers for their accents or humble origins and form conspiracies against those they dislike. Violence was not uncommon. Monastic disciplinary records contain numerous incidents of physical altercations between monks, everything from shoving matches in the cloister to serious assaults with kitchen implements or tools. At the Abbey of St Augustines in Canterbury, records from 1279 describe a monk named William who struck Brother John in the face, drawing blood during Matins. Sexual dynamics added another layer of complexity to monastic social life. While the ideal was complete celibacy, the reality was that monasteries were communities of men, many quite young, living in close proximity with limited outlets for their natural drives. Homoerotic attachments, consensual sexual relationships, and sexual abuse all occurred with enough frequency to merit constant warnings in monastic rules and customaries. The 12th century monastic writer Aelred of Rievaulx warned against special friendships between monks, describing in surprisingly explicit terms the dangers of emotional and physical attachments. The fact that such warnings were repeatedly issued suggests the problem was persistent. More disturbing are the records of sexual exploitation of novices and younger monks by those in positions of authority, a problem that medieval monastic leaders acknowledged but struggled to address effectively. For monks who didn't fit into the social structure, whether due to personality, background, or inability to conform, monastery life could be isolating and psychologically devastating. Unlike modern society, there was no escape from toxic social dynamics. You couldn't change jobs, move to a new city, or even take a mental health day. You were trapped with the same people, in the same power structures, day after day, year after year, until death. The monastic emphasis on public confession and communal punishment exacerbated social tensions. Imagine having to publicly admit every minor infraction before the entire community, then having your brothers vote on your punishment. This system easily became a tool for humiliation and social control, with unpopular monks receiving harsher penalties for the same infractions that might be overlooked in favourites. Could you survive this social pressure cooker? Could you navigate the complex hierarchies, the factions, the gossip, the potential for abuse from superiors with unchecked power? Could you maintain your sanity while living in enforced intimacy with the same group of men for decades, with no privacy and no escape? For most modern individuals, accustomed to being able to choose their social circles and leave toxic environments, the social reality of the medieval monastery would be among its most brutal aspects. When we think of monks, we often imagine men who've taken vows of poverty, owning nothing and living simple, materially detached lives. While individual monks were indeed supposed to renounce personal possessions, the economic reality of monasteries as institutions was far more complex and often contradictory to their spiritual ideals. Medieval monasteries were economic powerhouses, major landowners, agricultural producers, and financial entities. By the 13th century, monasteries controlled vast estates. The Abbey of Cluny, for example, owned over 10,000 properties across Europe. These weren't small holdings. They included entire villages, farms, forests, mines, and urban properties. This wealth created a fundamental tension in monastic life. How could institutions dedicated to spiritual values, including poverty, justify their enormous collective wealth? How could monks who personally owned nothing administer economic empires? This contradiction was never fully resolved and created both practical and psychological strains on monastic communities. For ordinary monks, the economic reality varied dramatically depending on their monastery's wealth and their position within it. The rule of St. Benedict stipulated that all monks should receive equal provisions. We believe that for the daily meal, whether at the 6th or the 9th hour, 2 cooked dishes should suffice. If fruit or fresh vegetables are available, a 3rd dish may be added. In practice, this egalitarian ideal was rarely achieved. In wealthy monasteries, abbots and high-ranking officials often ate better food, wore finer versions of the monastic habit, and enjoyed private accommodations with comforts like personal fireplaces. Meanwhile, ordinary monks, particularly those from humble backgrounds, made do with the basic provisions specified in the rule. The economic disparities between monasteries were even more dramatic. While prestigious houses like Westminster Abbey or Saint-Denis near Paris enjoyed enormous revenues that allowed for relatively comfortable living conditions, smaller, poorer monasteries struggled to provide even the basics. Monks in these less fortunate houses might genuinely suffer from malnutrition, inadequate clothing, and dangerous living conditions in crumbling buildings they couldn't afford to repair. A monk's daily experience of poverty or comfort was therefore heavily dependent on the accident of which monastery he joined. This created a system where, despite theoretical commitments to equality and detachment from material concerns, monks were acutely aware of economic hierarchies both within and between monastic communities. The administrative burden of managing monastic wealth fell heavily on certain monks. Those with education or administrative skills might find themselves spending more time managing agricultural estates, negotiating with tenants, or overseeing construction projects than in prayer or spiritual pursuits. Financial record-keeping, legal disputes over property, and economic planning became major preoccupations for many monastic officials. This created another contradiction. Monks who had theoretically renounced the world found themselves deeply enmeshed in worldly concerns of property management, profit maximization, and economic exploitation. The 13th century monk Matthew Paris complained that some of his brothers at St. Albans Abbey were more concerned with counting coins than counting prayers. For monasteries as institutions, economic pressures could compromise spiritual ideals in troubling ways. When revenues declined, as they often did during agricultural crises, wars or economic downturns, Monasteries faced difficult choices. Should they reduce their numbers, compromising their liturgical obligations? Should they cut charitable giving to the poor, undermining their social mission? Or should they find new sources of revenue, potentially through practices at odds with their spiritual values? Many chose the latter path. By the later Middle Ages, some monasteries engaged in economic activities that seemed increasingly at odds with their spiritual mission. They became aggressive landlords, harsh in collecting rents and enforcing labour obligations from their tenants. Some operated as de facto banks, making loans through creative arrangements designed to circumvent church prohibitions on usury. Perhaps most controversially, many monasteries derived substantial income from the spiritual economy of the later Middle Ages, selling prayers for the dead, collecting fees for masses, and marketing relics and indulgences. These practices, which essentially monetized spiritual services, eventually contributed to the critiques that fueled the Protestant Reformation. For individual monks, navigating these economic contradictions could be psychologically taxing. Imagine taking vows of poverty and then finding yourself responsible for evicting peasant families who couldn't pay their rents to your monastery. Or consider the cognitive dissonance of sleeping on a hard mattress in an unheated dormitory while your abbot enjoyed fine food and wine in private quarters, all justified as necessary for entertaining important visitors. The economic reality of monastic life also created practical hardships that varied by a monk's status and skills. Those brothers assigned to manual labour, working the fields, constructing buildings, or performing domestic tasks, experienced monastic poverty through physical toil and bodily wear. Meanwhile, those with administrative responsibilities experienced it through the stress of managing complex economic systems while trying to maintain spiritual focus. Could you reconcile these contradictions? Could you live personally without possessions while your institution amassed wealth? Could you maintain spiritual detachment while making economic decisions that affected hundreds or thousands of people? For many medieval monks, these economic tensions created a form of cognitive dissonance that added to the psychological burden of monastic life. We've stripped away the romantic veneer of medieval monasticism to reveal the brutal reality beneath: a life of physical hardship, psychological pressure, intellectual constraint, social complexity, and economic contradiction. The question remains, could you survive this life? For most modern people, the answer is almost certainly no, at least not without profound suffering. We're accustomed to personal autonomy, comfort, self-expression, and choice in ways that make the monastic regime seem like a prison sentence rather than a spiritual path. The sleep deprivation alone would break many of us within weeks. The constant cold, the monotonous diet, the lack of privacy, the unrelenting schedule, these physical challenges would be formidable even before considering the psychological dimensions of constant surveillance, enforced silence, and absolute obedience. Yet thousands of medieval men not only survived but sometimes thrived in this environment. How? Partly through the power of religious conviction, a genuine belief that their suffering was spiritually meaningful, that their discomfort in this life would be rewarded in the next. The medieval worldview, which saw earthly existence as merely a brief prelude to eternal life, made sacrifices seem rational in ways we struggle to comprehend today. Adaptation and psychological compartmentalization also played crucial roles. Medieval monks developed coping mechanisms, finding meaning in ritual, creating mental spaces for private thought within outward conformity, forming supportive relationships despite institutional constraints. Some found genuine fulfillment in aspects of monastic life: the beauty of liturgical music, the satisfaction of skilled craftsmanship, or the intellectual stimulation available to those fortunate enough to access it. It's also important to remember that, for many, the alternatives to monastic life were equally harsh in different ways. In a world of subsistence agriculture, endemic violence, limited medical care, and rigid social hierarchies, the monastery offered certain advantages: regular meals, some healthcare, education, and a degree of security rarely available to common people. But we shouldn't romanticize medieval monks as uniformly serene spiritual athletes who embraced their harsh lifestyle with unwavering faith. Monastic records are filled with evidence of struggle. Monks who ran away, monks who broke rules repeatedly despite punishments, monks who descended into depression or other psychological disorders, monks who simply went through the motions while inwardly detached from their spiritual commitments. The brutal reality of medieval monastic life serves as a powerful reminder of both human adaptability and the high price of certain forms of spiritual striving. These men created cultural and intellectual achievements of lasting value while living under conditions that would break most modern individuals. Their endurance testifies to the strength of religious conviction in shaping human behaviour and the remarkable capacity of humans to find meaning in suffering when that suffering is embedded in a coherent worldview. So the next time you see a serene image of a medieval monk illuminating a manuscript or strolling through a cloister garden, remember the reality behind the image. The 2 a.m. wake-up calls, the freezing stone floors, the hunger, the silence, the surveillance, the social tensions, and the unrelenting psychological pressure. Remember that the beautiful religious artifacts and manuscripts we admire today were produced in conditions we would consider inhumane by modern standards. Could you survive as a medieval monk? Perhaps the better question is, what does it tell us about human nature that anyone could?